Thank God it's Monday. It's time for All In, episode number 13. This week I take you to Budapest, Hungary to interview Foursquare missionary David Ballantyne. In this episode, we'll be talking about listening to the city, hearing the way that God has already been working in the place where you are at in order for you to cooperate with what God is already doing to help you live a missional life. Hit it, Elizabeth. You're listening to All In. This is the podcast dedicated to helping you fulfill the mission of God in your life and around the world. I'm your host, Jeff Rupert. Hey everybody, welcome to today's podcast. It's my privilege to interview David Ballantyne. He's one of our Foursquare missionaries serving in Budapest. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to be here.
Hey, it's always fun to talk with you. One of my favorite people to hang out with. We've had a lot of good memories. Remember the first time you and I went to Russia together, and boy, that's a number of years back, and had a good time back then.
What goes on the road stays on the road, Jeff.
This be true, so we won't go into much more of that. Hey, what I wanted to talk to you about first of all is something you walked us through there in Budapest a few years ago. You had Debbie and myself, along with you and Susan, and Dennis Easter and his wife. You walked us through this thing called, you called it Listening to the City, and the basic idea is where you hear and you listen to what God has already been doing in the city before you got there, so it helps shape your missional expression. At least that was my understanding of what you were doing. Would you take some time and explain it to us about what was happening and how you learned to do that and all the nuances of it?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I wish I could take credit for that, as an original thought. Of course, all of us kind of draw from resources that either we find inspiring or applicable. And, it was clear that coming from central Montana into a completely different context in Central Eastern Europe, into a city of about 2 million, which the city of Budapest has twice as many people as the state of Montana. So the ministry that we had for 16 plus years developed in Montana was successful on some levels there. So it would be tempting to just come into this context in Hungary and begin to presume that what we had done there, we could just translate very linearly into ministry in Hungary. Thankfully, I was interrupted in that process. I felt like God kind of said to me very clearly that there was going to be a deconstruction that was going to take place within at least the practices that I had given myself to as a pastoral leader in North America. And I didn't necessarily fully understand what that meant, but I knew I needed to begin to equip myself with some understandings of what it would look like to be whatever success can look like as a missionary. What does it mean to be a successful missionary? And one of the things that I think I learned, I'm not even sure how I learned it. It was probably someone wiser and smarter came alongside and said, "Listen, David, you're going to have to not presume on the culture you're going into." And here's some readings to spend some time in. And one of the authors was Alan Roxburgh, and of course he's the guy I think that probably coined the term listening to the city. But I listened to Alan. I listened to, of course, Dennis Easter, who is the supervisor down in most of LA now. And as we were conversing, developed just this basic framework of understanding that it is presumptuous of a missionary to go into any cultural context with the idea that we have the answers to the issues and the needs of that local community. Not that we don't know who the answer is, but that the answers that we tend to carry with us are far more program focused, far more experience based in terms of where we've come from than they are born out of the local community, born out of the local culture, born out of the local context. So, how do you equip yourself? How do you develop an ability to ask the right questions of the city you're in? And so listening to the city really is just the idea that we don't really have any answers. We don't come with predetermined programs that we can plug and play here in the city of Budapest. So what do we do? Well, the first place of humility, I think, in any relationship is learning and listening. And can we do that in a city context? Is there anything that this city is saying that I can listen to as a missionary that would inform how I would do ministry in this local context? So it takes a posture of saying, I don't know, which for some people that's easier said than done. But if you don't take that posture, then you're going to come with a high level of idealism, probably, as well as a certain imperialistic idea of how the gospel needs to be interpreted in a local context here in Budapest. And you're going to make a lot of mistakes. You're going to be answering questions that no one's asking. And so in order to eliminate as much of that as possible, asking the question, okay, what am I seeing here? What am I hearing from this people? What am I hearing from my neighbors? What are the structures of the city telling me about the city itself? How is God already working here that that I'm seeing and can participate in practical ways that would inform a more successful missional presence here in Budapest. So that's the basic idea behind listening to the city. It's a posture of saying, what am I seeing? What am I hearing? How is this going to inform the kinds of questions that I will ask of my neighbors in order to engage in a conversation of faith? And so that's what listening to the city basically is.
How long have you been there in Budapest?
7 years.
So tell me how it worked when you first got there and you started implementing this. What would that look like?
Well, in a very practical sense, this doesn't seem too spiritual, but basically just learning to live in the city is the first thing. It's it's one thing to come into a city for a couple of weeks and to act the tourist, and I've done that most of my life, and can do that pretty well. But it's a whole different exercise when you begin to basic issues of life need to begin to be worked through in a long-term frame of reference, and that involves again just living here. How do you do that well? How do you pay your bills? How does the population deal with the basic issues of life? So you begin to live with people, and so that's the first step in listening. Is you have to have a recognized sense of identity in the city, and that requires that you just live there. So the first thing was we just began to live, and as you live, then you're prayerfully asking questions of Lord, what are you showing me here? What is happening here? I don't understand why they do it this way, and that can be something that may just be personal, or it can be something that works into maybe a potential strategy for when you launch in what would be called, a ministry sense.
So would that entail, on a practical side, maybe you went down to Gloria Jean's coffee house and you would sit and just watch and observe and ask the Lord, help me see this as you see it. What were you saying? Because God is always speaking. God is always working. And I think this is one of those things that we have seen dealing with sometimes short-term missionary teams. Short-term mission trips. People think, well, we're going to go take God to those people. And God doesn't need to be taken anywhere. God is already there.
Right.
and he's already shaping the nations that they might seek after him. So
Hmm.
you're sitting at Gloria Jean's coffee house, and you're watching and you're listening and saying, Lord, teach me, show me how you're already drawing these people in. Is that kind of what it would entail?
It does entail that, but I think there's more pre-work, and the pre-work may not be so much fun. Sometimes it is, depending on your interest in history. But I would say it's doing the simple exegesis of the history of the nation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who are these people? Where do they come from? Why are they a nation now? What's the drivers in this particular city? And so, looking at all the historic sites, listening to the stories of the museums, going into um, uh, places that tell the story of who this people is, and letting them tell you their story, and not making any prejudgments,
Mm-hmm.
letting that just inform then your coffee shop sits.
Yeah.
And coffee shop sits are good, but it's better if you do that with people, and because they're the holders of the story.
Yeah.
So the more people that you can connect with on a personal level that are native to your city, obviously the better.
Yeah. Well, I think you bring up a critical issue here, which is learning to see the hand of God through the history of a people, and learning how historical issues shape their worldview, how it shapes their outlook. There's a square there in Budapest, not far from your home. I remember you taking us to, and it's got a large statue of the king with the crown. And tell us the story about that. That was such a fascinating. It's got the crown with the bent cross on it.
Yeah, yeah, that's Hero Square, and it really is probably the single most symbolic uh, place in the city in terms of who are the Hungarian people, where do they come from, and so you have to go to Hero Square. You have to understand, the statues that are there and why they're there, and really the center of that square there's a large column. It's probably 90 meters tall, and it has actually not a king on it, but it's Gabriel who is holding in his hand. He's got the crown of Hungary in his hand, and it represents the the idea that God has given to Hungary its national identity. And then surrounding that pillar is a series of significant kings who, down through the history of Hungary, which is over 1,000 years old, kings that had major influences impacting the course of the nation. And of course, the first king, Stephen, or in the Hungarian, it's István. He was the son of a tribal leader who was next to be in line to take over the tribal leadership from his father, and he ends up going to Italy and he converts to Catholicism. And in that move, he's renamed István or Stephen. He comes back to Hungary and he's given kingship over this group of seven wandering tribes that have camped out in this area called Hungary. And because of his conversion to Catholicism, now in the Catholic theology, Hungary becomes a Catholic nation. And so Stephen did a great job, actually, of modernizing these tribal people and developed a society and culture around a Catholic belief system. And so Catholicism was at the very heart of the beginning of the Hungarian people, and it has been for 1,000+ years. So that, in and of itself, tells you a whole lot about what you're going to be dealing with if you come to the nation of Hungary.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be a very ensconced Catholic root
Mm-hmm.
that is tied back to identity, even if it isn't tied to practice. So they may not be practicing Catholics now, but they identify themselves as Catholics because that's who they are as Hungarians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon here in Europe that even though religion, actual living faith, is almost non existent in the population, there's still a cultural identity. To be at a to be Italian is to be Catholic. You might be an atheist, but you're still a good Catholic.
Right.
Or to be Polish is to be Catholic. Or here in Greece, where I'm at, to be Orthodox is to be Greek, and to be Greek is to be Orthodox. And so for some of these countries, it adds to the complexity of our mission, because a person who believes this way thinks that if they give up their religion of Catholicism, they also give up being Hungarian, or if you convert from a non-practicing Orthodox to a practicing Protestant in Russia, you cease being Russian in the Russian mentality. So it's something that we definitely have to deal with here as a stronghold and as a mindset within a European context. There's one of my favorite sermons that Paul gave was just down the road from where I'm sitting right now here in my apartment. It's about 5 metro stops, Mars Hill. And while Paul was on Mars Hill, he said this thing that really is amazing to me. He said that he made from one man every nation of mankind who live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek for God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, yet he is not actually far from each one of us. And here's Paul basically saying a very similar thing to what you're saying, that God has allotted the times and the boundaries of all the nations. He's shaped the history. He shaped the context of the land in order that they might feel their way to God. And, so as a mission-minded person, and I think this is applicable whether you're a missionary like yourself who's moved from one country to another, or you're a local pastor somewhere and you're trying to be missional, not just a chaplain of Christians, but missional in your community. To look at it and say, how has history and culture and all of these things intersected with the will of God and the plan of God for his own revelation of himself to bring these people into a vibrant relationship with himself? If you were to sit down with a church planter or a pastor of a local church and give them some basic coaching, what would be the 2 or 3 things you would start with now that you've got 7 years of experience in this cross-cultural endeavor? If you were to so many pastors are finding themselves in a cross-cultural endeavor now. Even in the United States, in the Northwest, where we both have roots at, is becoming more and more post-Christian. Not close to Europe, but maybe another 20 years or so, and they'll be there. What kind of advice would you give to either a church planter or a local pastor?
A lot of that was broken up, but I think I got the gist of what you were wanting to say. Skype was interfering just a little bit. No, but I think we're back in real time now. Again, I think the first thing is the basic posture of any pastoral, missionary leader has got to be one of humility, rather than presumptuousness. As we take our ministry into our local context. And so something like listening to the city provides opportunities for you to practice humility. Now, it's pretty easy when you live in the United States of America and you're an American, you're inundated with the cultural messages, what people are thinking and what they're struggling with. And so you just begin to assume on them the answers that and so I think it's harder. I really do think it's harder for some of my friends in the Pacific Northwest dealing with the post-Christian shifts that are taking place there to begin to try to think like a missionary. Others maybe would disagree with that, but I think the fact that you're living in the U.S. makes it harder to take on the discipline of not jumping to the answer before the question is fully formed. Mm-hmm. So the first thing I think is just being really, really humble and continuing to listen to what's being said by the people around you. And if you don't have that, then you tend to get very myopic. You see only what you want to see, and you hear only what you want to hear. And I'll give you an example. Um, we had to change out the water heater in our flat, and this happened about 2 months ago. And in order to do that, they had to rip off, most of the ceiling in the hallway. And so they pulled the water tank out, and I was told that they would they'd come back and fill the hole. Well, the hole is quite large. It's probably 3 feet long, and it's a terrible mess in the hallway. But after about 2 or 3 months of not having the hole filled yet, it's amazing how much I just walk down the hallway and I don't even see the hole anymore. Now, there's still a gaping hole over my head, but I don't even look there because it's so familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happens, I think, when you live in the U.S. and you're seeing these shifts and you recognize them initially, and you decide, yeah, I need to probably respond to this. But after a while, unless you're continuing to ask yourself the question, what's up above my head? Is there still a hole there? And why is it there? And what's it? That's the posture that a missionary deals with in very practical terms every single day, because we can't get away from the fact that we are guests in a foreign place.
Yeah.
And so our place requires humility. So I see humility is the key to the gospel advancing well, because you ask better questions.
Yeah.
Second thing I would say is this: the incarnation invites you to embrace culture rather than reject it. Jesus came into a particular culture.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't come to extract people out of their cultural experiences and say, I'm going to form a people that are so different that everybody else won't recognize them.
Right.
He came into a Jewish context, and he lived as an exemplary Jewish man. And the incarnation requires of us that we come into our local cultural context and embrace it. And that doesn't mean that we don't recognize there's some things in it that are dangerous and even just flat out wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But if what you're doing is critiquing the cultural milieu that you're in, you're going to be identified maybe as a raging prophet, but you won't have any prophetic insight into the people that you're with.
Yeah.
So you've got to embrace the culture, and you've got to learn to love it as God does, because God's not rejecting that culture. There are going to be people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. What's that say? It says there's going to be very different cultural expressions around the throne, and they will not be lost in, if there is a rapture, the rapture, or if there is just the assumption of the kingdom here on earth. We'll all still recognize the distinctives that we bring to the table culturally. Yeah. So I think those are two very practical things to do.
Very good. Very good. Now, you've been on the ground there for 7 years. What would you say have been some of the big lessons that you've learned coming into this now, that you look back on and say, this is where I've grown, or how I've changed, or what I've learned since I've been living here for these years?
Wow. That's a big question. It's going to sound redundant. But I had a heart attack in 2009 here.
Mm-hmm.
I chose to be treated here. Otherwise, I could have gone maybe elsewhere to do that. I think that was a good choice. I think that was not just a good choice because I'm obviously still alive at this stage, but I think it really broke me back to basic issues of life living here. I had to trust at a level that I didn't trust maybe natively when I first came here.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is I had to trust God called me here. And God could take my life here. So I was willing to live here, and I was willing to die here. And I don't know how I can describe it effectively, but when you go through that process, missions is not, kind of a cool thing to do.
Right.
It's life and death.
Yeah.
And so my whole construct of who I am and how I view living in Budapest has been dramatically shaped by the fact that I am called here, and until that call is rescinded through whatever, either the Lord takes me home or it's, we just feel like the assignment has been finished. I give my life for this,
Hmm.
and I would give my life for this, and I might give my life for this.
Yeah, you never know. If you had a time machine and you were able to go back in time to the and talk to the 25-year-old David Ballantyne, head full of hair and life full of vinegar and faith, and hey, we're going to go conquer the world.
Yeah.
What advice would you give yourself?
I would say get with Jerry Cook a lot sooner than I did.
Why so?
Well, Jerry no longer is with us here. He's on the other side waiting. But he was a guy that transformed my whole way of thinking about ministry while I was in the States. And of course, he's known as Mr. Love, Acceptance, and Forgiveness.
Right.
And at 25 years old, I had all the answers, and I knew how to give you the answer that you weren't even asking for. And I could give it with lots of vim and vinegar, and I could convict you even if you didn't want to be convicted, or I could condemn you, and likely condemned you first anyway. Um, so the whole sense of understanding a proper grace in the gospel came through mentoring with a man that had such maturity in the gospel. He modeled it through the way he lived and his attitudes, and he was very accessible to me. So I would say get with someone that really has developed maturity and can answer your tough questions about what faith looks like in real terms.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a heart attack or when you go through life crisis, and all of those verses that you have been praying that Jesus would respond to aren't apparently being heard by him. And you're going through ministry challenges, and half your staff leaves and goes with you know, Pastor X, or you're no longer the hottest ticket in town. How do you respond well to that and graciously? But beyond that, I would say, and particularly now in this season of our global history, don't assume that people in your cultural context want to come to church. In fact, assume the exact opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Prepare yourself, even if you say, I'm just a local pastor in town X, and I just want to take care of the flock. I want to suggest to you that taking care of the flock is not about having a great worship service with a hot band and taking a nice offering and filling out gold sheets, as wonderful as all that is.
Mm-hmm.
But it's about having a congregation of people engage their neighborhood like Jesus did effectively. And that's the biggest challenge that you'll face. So how do you do that well? Learn that at 25. You're going to cut years out of lots of challenges in your ministry.
How are you finding the expression of this in Budapest now? Tell us what's going on there at the bridge.
Okay. Are we still in real time? Because
We
you're
are.
freezing. Okay, good. Um, what the bridge is, it is a church, but we don't use that necessarily as our language. We would call ourselves a missional community, but that's a little bit jingoistic even now. So we probably don't even label it other than the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
But we are a community of people that are made up of probably half expats and then half Hungarians. So it's a blended community.
Mm-hmm.
When we first started the bridge, I said, "Listen, I don't have any form to this. There's no liturgy that we're going to follow. We want to break it back to building community around some of the principles that we see Jesus modeling for us." So we've said, our main focus is to eat, talk, and to live. So, and that's three words that define our practice
Mm-hmm.
in the bridge. And so eating is, obviously having a meal. And there's some practical things that you do when you eat a meal together. You get rid of all of the reasons why they can't come at dinner time.
Yeah.
But more importantly, we believe that a meal is also an expression of communion, and that we express communion together at the table. And so we focus on just meeting together at the table. And that is something that's really, it meets a practical need for people building friendships. But in a culture like Hungary or in Budapest, where it's an international city and people are going and they don't always have a lot of times where they just sit down together and eat with people.
Mm-hmm.
We're building community around a practice that we think is biblically supported through everything that we see God doing in terms of building covenant with people around meals,
Yeah.
including the Last Supper. And we do that in a very practical way in the Bridge. We transition from eating to talking.
Mm-hmm.
And we use talking as a metaphor for listening from God and talking about what we're seeing God say to us through the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
So we let the Bible speak to us, and that informs our communication.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And then living then is the expression of what do we do in the city when we're not in the Tuesday meeting. Well, that's the most important aspect of it. Missional means your neighbor is more important than what you do on Tuesday night. Mm-hmm. And so what you do on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and Saturday, Sunday, Monday and Tuesday with your people in your cubicles, with the people that you live with, that is where you live ministry. And that is where your missional presence needs to be most prominently felt. So how do we do that well?
And you guys have also started a Serve the City in Budapest as well, haven't you?
Yeah, Serve the City. Yeah, it's a volunteering organization that basically we look for needs in our city that are practical, that no one's meeting, and then we solicit volunteers to meet that need. And it's inspired by, equate it to any faith-based thing. Mm-hmm. Because Hungary is decidedly post-Christian,
right?
Even though they would identify, again, as you say, as Hungarian Catholics. So if we identify it with the church, then we've cut out most of the people that we want to have involved in these projects. Right. So we use it as a way to get volunteers to meet a specific need, like cleaning up a street or feeding the homeless. Our interest is doing that with people that we don't yet know from the city. Great. And so Serve the City gives us a chance to meet people.
Great. Now, if there's somebody listening to the podcast that would like to connect with you, maybe pick your brain about some stuff and how they could apply this into their own context, how would they be able to reach you?
We do have a Facebook page, but it's secret, so you have to have a secret code.
You have to have the secret handshake and everything, huh?
All that, yeah. No, actually, if they're interested, if they're on Facebook and they use that, they can actually just find me on David Ballantyne. Okay. On Facebook.
Okay.
And then just send me a little message to the Facebook and say, I'd like to be in the Bridge group and just watch what you're doing. We'd love to include them in that. Then also you can just contact me via email at davidballantyne4@mac.com. Okay. So,
and we'll include both your email address and your Facebook page, your personal page on the show notes as well, so people can check that as well. Right. Well, David, it's been a joy to have you with us today, and as always stimulating conversations with you.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's been fun. I've enjoyed this.
Well, great. David and I are both supported by Foursquare Missions International, so if you've ever wondered what your Global Missions Fund do, you just heard. God bless you guys. Well, we're done now. Thanks for listening. This is Jeff Roper reminding you that the mission of God is too grand for mediocrity or average living. You were created for a purpose, and that purpose is found in the mission of God. It's your life. Now go live it.